In 1638, 8 years after the original settlement of Boston, a ship called the Desire arrived there. And for the next 350 years, our country would be plunged into a moral dilemma. This ship carried a cargo that had never before been delivered to the shores of this country. America accepted its first human cargo. Today, many believe our history should be presented in a way that speaks to the contributions of African Americans to this country. And although this is important, as long as we are committed to this concept, we miss the more significant question. The question is not our contributions to America, but how to end our oppression in America. African Americans working towards that end began their struggle with our involvement in the Revolutionary War.
So if we go back to the eve of the war, here you have 500,000 black people, most of whom are enslaved. And they see these two forces about to get involved in this struggle for political supremacy. The British offered the slaves, or the black population, freedom if they joined the British. Automatic. If you join the army, the British Army, if you enlist and fight against these rebels, you are automatically free. The settlers, on the other hand, the people they call Americans, on the other hand, were very reluctant because they knew that they had a real problem because this was their property. And they didn't want to offer them that opportunity because they would lose all this property. And so they were very reluctant. Finally, they did offer the enslaved population the opportunity to participate in the war, and gave them some vague promise about freedom. But if you look at the black people who made a choice, who are recorded as having made a choice between the British and the settlers, that is, between the British and the Americans, the thing that stands out is that more of them sided with the British than with the Americans. And that automatically undermines the contribution theory of history. Mm-hmm. What they were looking for was how to get out of this mess. And many of them saw that the British offered a better proposal because the British offered them two things. Number one, immediate freedom. And number two, if we lose the war, we will take you with us.
When the war was over, 25,000 Africans left with the British and 5,000 sided with the Americans. This gives us an idea of the real mindset of the enslaved Africans. The ones who stayed found themselves in an unbearable situation. Their dilemma was that the country they chose would now constitutionally guarantee the slave property system. So African Americans began to look for answers, and from their search sprang a generation of leaders who directed their attention to this problem. Paul Cuffey, a millionaire shipping magnate, introduced the concept of separation from America. He was convinced that the Africans in America would never be treated as equals and spent much of his time and resources repatriating Africans.
One of the things that happened as a result of Paul Cuffey was that Americans of the South and the North decided that the best way to deal with the free black population was to get rid of them. And so they started this Liberian colony and tried to convince so-called free black people to immigrate to Liberia. And a number of them did. I mean, this is also the generation of people like John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, who started the first black newspaper, the Freedom's Journal. And that's interesting because one of them decided to go to Africa, Russwurm, and the other one to Liberia, and the other one, Cornish, decided to stay here and fight. And ultimately, what the Liberian project did was to make the black people who didn't want to go to Liberia, or who for one reason or another didn't go to Liberia, to stop and think about this situation. And that is it wise for us to leave at this time? Even those who felt that ultimately the black people had to leave America, some of them began to say, is it wise for us to leave at this time? And they said, well, many of them decided, no, we're not ready to leave. We're not going to leave till everybody can leave, till everybody can make a choice. And therefore, we're going to stay here and fight till we bring this monster down, this chattel slave system down. And so what you had then remaining were what was a kind of a unity between those who still wanted to try this integration, this assimilation, and those who said it'll never work. And they decided to stay, join hands, and try to dismantle the slave system. And that is when the Underground Railroad became, what is called the Underground Railroad, became an important factor. Until that time, black people had been leaving their places of enslavement one by one. One morning, the master would wake up, and John is gone. And maybe, if John is lucky, the master never knows where he went, never hears from him again. So one by one, I call that the self-emancipation project, and I think that's the way we ought to look at it instead of just talking about the Underground Railroad. So black people were emancipating themselves by whatever means they could find. But what happened in the 1820s, 1830s, was that black people, along with the white abolitionists, began to put together a systematic system of support for black people who were liberating themselves. We shouldn't assume that the Underground Railroad liberated them. They were liberating themselves. The Underground Railroad was just simply a support system. Whenever they would run away, then they could go to various places and get some support on their way to wherever it was they were going, Canada, perhaps ultimately. But that system itself, which resulted from the cooperation of what we would call the proto-integrationists and the proto-nationalists, was really a major factor in terms of the panic in the southern part of the country among the plantation owners in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Because between 1820 and 1850, about 40,000 black people escaped from the plantations. And, that's like 40,000 horses from their standpoint. Much more drastic than 40,000 horses. I mean, that's property. They losing their property. And so they began to panic. And that's why they rushed the rest of the country into approving of the Fugitive Slave Act and so forth and so on.
In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act meant open season on all African Americans. This act created a clan of bounty hunters, officially known as agents, whose sole purpose was to capture and return African Americans into slavery. The fact that a percentage of the captured bounty was already free didn't deter the agents from their grim task.
The second Fugitive Slave Act is even more dangerous for African Americans because what the second Fugitive Slave Act allows, it allows planters to hire people to capture their slaves, and all they need for proof is just a magistrate saying that the person captured was a slave. And you could get a magistrate to do that for $10. So that really, with the second Fugitive Slave Act, no African American was really free, and we have lots of cases of African Americans who are just out on an evening stroll, say an after dinner stroll, who are caught up by slave catchers who pay a magistrate $10 to have these free people declared slaves, and they're taken south into slavery. And how can they be freed again? It's horrible. And many African Americans, after the second Fugitive Slave Act, that's when many African Americans go to Canada, because no place in the United States is safe any longer.
Whites did not subscribe to any principles of equality for African Americans. They just simply believed that African Americans were inferior. The privileges of citizenship, for example, the right to vote and the right to hold political office, were withheld. The rights of African Americans were further delayed by the Supreme Court decision in 1857 on the Dred Scott case.
Okay, Dred Scott was born a slave. he is a slave who belongs to an army doctor, John Emerson. He's born in Virginia. Emerson eventually takes him to a military camp, to military bases in Missouri and Illinois, and then eventually out to the Minnesota Territory. So he is a slave who's been taken from a slave state to a free state, Illinois, and then to a free territory, Minnesota. While he's in Minnesota, he marries a slave woman, has a child. Then Emerson brings the three of them back to Missouri, to the slave state. They have another child. Then Emerson dies. And when Emerson dies, of course, Dred Scott and his family their ownership shifts to another member of his family, the Emerson family. But Scott and some of his friends in the North his abolitionist friends and Northerners decide that they will petition for his freedom. They'll sue for his freedom on the grounds that he has been taken to a free territory or free state, and free land should make a free person. Because he has been taken there and brought back. He files, the suit is filed in the courts. He loses the first round, wins the second round, loses that one on appeal in the Missouri Supreme Court. Then it shifts over to the federal Supreme Court, where it's appeal again. And at that point, the Supreme Court has to basically address two questions. First of all, is he entitled to his freedom? Because he has been taken from a free state to a free territory. And second, I should reverse these. First, could he even sue for his freedom? And then second, is he free? The Chief Justice of the court at that time was Roger B. Taney. And Taney had freed his own slaves, but he was not an abolitionist. He was still very much in tune or supportive of the Southern way of life. So when the case gets to the court, Taney and the other justices on the court, in deciding this case and ruling on those two things, ruled first of all that Dred Scott could not sue in the Supreme Court or the federal courts because he is African American. African Americans, whether they're slave or free, were never intended to even be citizens. Citizens can sue, but not anybody who's African American, because the Constitution was not intended to include them in that way. And then second, that just because he had lived in a free state and territory did not make him a free person. That free territory, free land does not make free people. That in essence, Congress in essence could not even establish what was free territory or what was slave territory. They had no right to do this. The slaves were property, and an individual has a constitutional guarantee of protection of his property rights. So what you have here, number one, is a rejection of all possibility of citizenship rights for African Americans or the descendants of African Americans. And then number two, the rejection of the authority of Congress to establish what is slave or what is free territory, that property rights are sacred wherever property is taken. You have a protection of that property. So in essence, a person, a slave who escapes and goes to a northern territory and lives there for all this time, just as in this 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, they are being told that you are still not free, that you are never free, simply because you land in free territory. So that's Dred Scott decision. That's the impact of it. I think by extension, after the Civil War, freeing African Americans is not enough in a constitutional sense. The Emancipation Proclamation just establishes a precedent, doesn't really free anybody in essence. The 13th Amendment says that slavery cannot exist. So African Americans are free by Constitution. But then with this Dred Scott decision on the books, you've got this question of, are they citizens? Are they entitled to citizenship rights? So you must have another amendment that creates or recognizes an American citizenry, that establishes an American citizenry. And it's, in a sense, not just Africans and their descendants that you're dealing with. It's any person who is a citizen of the United States, anyone who is born or naturalized as a citizen. Born in this country, naturalized in this country, you are a citizen. And as a citizen, you're entitled to all the rights and privileges of citizenship. So that, in effect, overturns or presents, it recognizes a constitutional right or establishes a constitutional right that Dred Scott had not, that Dred Scott had rejected, that decision had rejected.
In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney rendered his decision in the Dred Scott case. The language in Taney's decision strongly supported the slave property system. In fact, as part of his decision, Taney described African Americans as beings of an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Taney believed that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
He said that indeed black people had no rights in this country because indeed when the nation was founded, black people were not part of the founding process. They were not part of the political process then. So they had no rights that white people had to obey. And for many abolitionists, that was a sign that they were going to have to become more radical. That was a sign that indeed they were going to have to physically resist slavery. And it's really after that that Frederick Douglass becomes much more vocal about the use of violence. John Brown becomes more convinced that violence is going to have to be used. Other people, because there's no way to protest what's happening to African Americans because they have no rights. There's no rights to build this case that they should be citizens upon. So that's clear. The whole system has to be overthrown.
On March 20th, 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published. This novel focused national attention on the cruelties of slavery. Although there was a focus on slavery, it remained a reality for many African Americans until January 1st, 1863, when President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect.
The Emancipation Proclamation was issued primarily as a war document. It was a document that freed slaves in areas still in rebellion against the Union as of January 1st, 1863. By that time, the war had been going on since 1861. Slaves had been leaving the plantations. They had essentially been emancipating themselves by leaving and going behind Union lines, catching up with the Union Army, finding whatever protection they could with the Union Army. But the Union was not really exactly sure what they were going to do on the issue of emancipation, because this war to begin with was not a war to end slavery. When Lincoln is announcing or is declaring the purpose, the aim of the war, it is a war to restore the Union. And whatever that form of restoration is going to take as of 1861, he wasn't really sure. Would it be a restoration in which you would have some people free, some people slaves? Would it be all people free? Would it be nobody free? Whatever it took, the key point was to restore the Union. In the early years of the war, Union generals had to decide what would they do with the slaves who were escaping and coming to their lines. And some of them just declared that they were contraband of war, which means that this is captured property that belongs to your enemy. And when this conflict ends, then you decide what will be done with this captured property. Will it be returned to the enemy or not? Lincoln, after about a year, says in essence that contraband taken in war that is being used to help defeat the Unions will not be returned. But they still haven't decided anything on emancipation. And that was because they were really wrestling with this question of full emancipation or gradual emancipation or emancipation with colonization somewhere out of the United States. They were also wrestling with the fact that for the first year of the war, there were very few real Union victories. The Confederates, on the other hand, were winning many major victories in the Western theater. So if they issued an Emancipation Proclamation, it might seem like an act of desperation of a losing army, that they were trying to just destroy this area because they were losing. So they were waiting, in essence, for something, for a victory. They also had to consider that that the Confederates were getting support from foreign countries, from England and France, and they needed to cut that off. Now, the Confederates, of course, didn't have, they lacked manufacturing, and that was something that they needed to get from England and France. So there are all kinds of issues, war issues, that they have to deal with before, and emancipation is only one part of it. It's not, in a sense, the major issue. They are getting pressure from the abolitionists to use the war as a time to emancipate the slaves. In September, late August, September of 1862, they do have what seems to be almost a victory at the Battle of Antietam. So they've got an opening, they've got a period when they can issue this proclamation. They want to issue the proclamation to keep England and France out of the war, to keep them from officially recognizing the existence of the Confederate States of America as a separate nation and then giving support for this. They are getting the pressure from the abolitionists, but they don't want a full emancipation because there are still 4 slaveholding states in the Union. And to give a full emancipation, to say, in effect, something like the 13th Amendment, which they'll do later, might have driven these other 4 states out of the Union and into the Confederacy. So with all those things in mind, in September, Lincoln issues a preliminary proclamation that all states still in rebellion, all states and areas still in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863, in those areas, slaves will be emancipated. So he's giving them something like a 3-month time period to end the rebellion, because that's the major issue of the war. January 1st, 1863 comes along. There are still states in rebellion. So he issues a final proclamation, which first of all says why he's doing it. It is a fit and necessary war measure. Then says places where it will take effect. That there are some areas that are, say in Virginia, that are accepted, areas in the western part of Virginia, because those areas are seceding, they're leaving the state of Virginia to form another state, West Virginia, and come into the Union as a Union state. That parts of parishes along the Mississippi River in Louisiana that have already been recaptured, that they will be exempted. Tennessee, as I said before, is not included because Tennessee has, for the most part, fallen. You have a Battle of Memphis that is in something like June or July of 1862. You have parts of Tennessee that are still fighting, but the state is essentially recaptured. So it's not even included. And then he just, names the other states where the Emancipation Proclamation will take effect. There's also a section that says we encourage basically African Americans to be a little cautious. Don't just get up and run around and kill all your slave owners or whatever. And welcoming any blacks who would want to join the Union forces, that they would be accepted into the Union forces and as fighters. So here you have created basically what Southerners have always dreaded, and that is the possibility that African Americans will be given weapons, that they will be encouraged to fight against the slaveholders, that you are freeing the slaves in those areas. Now, the problem basically is that slaves are freed in areas where they are still controlled by the Confederate Army. So it's like freeing your neighbor's dog. Do you have the authority to do this? Can you go and try to open up the gate and free your neighbor's pet? Can you just go and liberate what is in your neighbor's house? And don't you think your neighbor is going to try to prevent you from doing this? So the Emancipation Proclamation does something of the same thing. It is not the document that the abolitionists were hoping for, but it is the document that they get. So they use it, and they take it and they run with it. And people like Frederick Douglass become very active, Martin Delany become very active in recruiting black soldiers.
Most of these blacks fought in units headed by whites, and in areas that were surrounded by whites, because there was always a question about whether the black soldiers would know which whites to shoot at, and so they had to have some white leaders to help them aim the right way. But Martin Delany talked Lincoln into allowing him to organize an all-black army, because he said, and Martin Delany had been to Africa, of course, and he had studied, he said, African military tactics, and he felt that he could organize a black unit that would win the war just like that. And so Lincoln thought that was a pretty good idea, and he allowed Delany to organize that unit, but he held it in check. And he intended to use it only if he had to. But they won the war before he had to use Delany's unit, and so it was dismantled.
Although Martin Delany's unit was dismantled, 200,000 African Americans eventually joined the military forces, representing 1/10 of the Union Army.
They are organized into units of what becomes known as the United States Colored Guard. They are organized out of contraband camps in places like Memphis, places like parts of Mississippi, Corinth, Mississippi. They go to the contraband camps and they recruit black men from these camps to join these military units. And they are sent out to fight. They're trained and then they're sent out to fight. And they fight very gallantly and in different battles. The stakes are pretty high, because if they are captured, they will either be executed or they will be sold back into slavery. And the whites who command them will probably be executed as well. That's, in essence, the Emancipation Proclamation. Does it really free anybody? No. Is it an encouragement for slaves to leave plantations? Yes, that's what it's designed to do, to undermine the economic forces in the South, because the slaves, as long as they stay on their plantation and continue to work and produce, then they are a very positive economic force for the South. But the idea is that if they know that they're free, then maybe they will act on this. Maybe they will try to escape, and many of them do.